who went to Europe or the Pacific to fight those bloody wars. Millions and millions more sacrificed at home to support the war effort. Citizens everywhere gladly participated in sacrifice, happily participated in the rationing of food and all kinds of supplies. They supported paper drives and rubber drives, and industries of all sorts rallied to the war effort. And the entire nation decided to just overlook their differences and their disagreements and come together in their common struggle. And all across the country, the conduct and conversations of people changed. People were no longer identifying themselves primarily by their differences or their distinctions. They were no longer saying things like, I'm a rebel, I'm a Yankee, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm Irish, I'm from Wisconsin. Instead, people would say, I'm an American. We're Americans. And something called the American spirit was born. And now many look back at those days and refer to those people as the greatest generation. In Philippians 1, 27 to 30, Paul tells us that there is something that should unite those of us who are citizens of heaven and soldiers of the cross and have an impact on our conduct and conversations just like that. Look at verse 27 again. Let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ. That phrase is the key phrase, the key verb from this section, and comes from the Greek politio. You might hear the word politics there. Not exactly what we think of. I'm not a big fan of politics or politicians usually, but it has more of the idea of citizenship. People who are citizens of a country. And it means to live as citizens. Now, this was written to Christians in Philippi, and this would have had significant meaning to them because they, for the most part, were Roman citizens living in a Roman colony a long ways away from Rome. But even though they were a long ways from Rome, they had the distinct advantage of being citizens of Rome and were expected to conduct themselves as such, even when they were a long ways away from Rome. Paul is reminding them, and us, that we are citizens of heaven and that we should live as citizens of heaven even while we're here on earth. That is the overarching command of this section of the book of Philippians. And notice that the verse begins with this word, only. Only let your conduct. It has the idea of just this one thing. We're talking about some stuff. I'm telling you about my struggles. I'm either going to live or die. I'm not really sure which, and so forth. But in lieu of all of that, or in light of all that, rather, there is this one thing that I want to talk to you about. Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ. This is the one thing I want you to focus on. So Paul here is not going to give them a grocery list of commands. He is saying that there's one thing that needs to be the priority. It reminds me a bit of my high school basketball days. Thankfully, we had a really tiny Christian school, so if you wanted to be a starter on the basketball team, you probably could be. But I remember some of those games near the end, you'd have a close game, and you're not really sure how it's going to end. It's coming right down to the wire, and the coach would call a timeout. And he'd get out that little marker board and put on some X's and O's, and James is going to try to pass the ball into David, and Kevin is going to cut through the key. Petitt, I want you to set a pick. Obviously not take the shot, set the pick. You're going to set the pick, and then if we score, they're not going to have a lot of time left. They're going to try to come down and score quickly. And one thing you can't do, don't foul. One thing, don't foul. Everybody hear me? Don't. Let's all say it together. Don't foul. So we'd run the play. Kevin would score. They'd bring the ball down. I'm a post player. In that league, I was actually big. Don't laugh, basketball players. But they come down, and I foul. And so the other team now is on the free throw line, calmly hitting free throws. They win the game. And you know you're going to hear about that for the rest of your life, and especially you're going to pay for it the following week in practice. I gave you one job. I told you to do one thing. I told you not to do one thing. I told you not to foul. What's wrong with you? I got all ball, coach. Every time, of course. But Paul is telling us that citizens of heaven have one big priority, one thing. This is the priority here, he's saying. I want you, and it's pretty comprehensive, I want you to conduct yourselves as citizens of heaven, but you're living somewhere else. You're living down here on earth. This is your colony right now. And I want you to live lives that are worthy of the gospel. And then he gives them, there in verse 27, if you'll look, two keys to accomplishing that, two ways to accomplish that. Number one, stand firm, he says, in one spirit. This would refer to a soldier standing his post with unflinching courage, regardless of how the battle rages. And the second is to strive together for the gospel, indicating a couple of things. One, we are in a fight. Two, we're fighting for something worthwhile. It's a worthy fight. We're fighting for the faith of the gospel. We're fighting for the essentials, the things that really matter. And I am sure that the citizens of Philippi would not have missed the imagery, thinking about their empire, their Roman Empire, and their armies, their legions that would march out and fight. As I'm not there, I didn't see it, but I can imagine General Maximus, leading his Roman legions against some Germanic tribes, and they're having their battle. You can see in your mind's eye thousands of well-trained, disciplined Roman soldiers advancing in unison towards some enemy, moving together almost like a living organism, one for all and all for one. But try to imagine something really absurd for a second. This army has decided that it can't tolerate wounded people, and it's going to kill its own wounded. General Maximus, Brutus just sprained his ankle. Oh, really? Kill him! That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You're not going to survive very long if your army is killing its own wounded. That would be absurd. And yet, too often, that is how the citizens of heaven act here on earth. Instead of striving together for the faith of the gospel, we become well known for just striving against each other, looking for ways to hurt or divide. You can't wait for the next piece of juicy gossip to come our way so that in holy reverence we can express our concern. Did you hear what happened? You hear what Pastor so-and-so did? Oh, no. Tell me. I'm so sorry. Yeah, he did this and this. Oh, we need to pray. And sometimes cloaked in spiritual holiness, we are eager to hear and share and destroy and tear. We can't wait to stab our wounded. Churches are just full of sinners looking for chances to expose other sinners. Reminds me of growing up on the farm, and every now and then we get a little crate of baby chicks. And if one of those baby chicks gets a sore, the rest of them will peck that sore until that chick dies. They'll peck that chick to death. And Christians are way too much like that. Our mentalities are so much like that. We just can't wait to get a chance to tear down and destroy. And so instead of rallying around the gospel, too many of us are just looking for ways to drive wedges between God's people, between churches, finding endless reasons to separate, usually over the non-essentials. Just last night, I received a copy of an email from a guy who has served for many years on the faculty and top administration of more than one Bible college. My guess is that some of you are on his mailing list. And I thought, this guy has given me the perfect illustration for my sermon tomorrow. So in the informational email, he writes a list of things that he thinks indicates that a church is on the slippery slope toward denying the Bible. Pretty serious stuff, right? Denying the Bible, pretty serious stuff. Here are his top 5 things on that list. He listed other things. These were the first 5. This is how you know that you're headed toward apostasy. This is how you know that you're on the slippery slope toward denying the Bible, he said. Number 1 on the list, hymnals disappear. Well, we must be there because I don't even see any in here. Number 1 thing on the list. Number 1 thing on the list. Of all the things you can say, number 1 on the list. This is how you know you're headed against the Bible. Hymnals. I don't know if I even can say that right. Hymnals, that's probably right. Hymnals disappear. Number 2 on the list of the slippery slope. The organ disappears. I'm not joking. I've got the email. I can show you. Quote, the Bible does not require that a church should have an organ, but trying to replace it with a tinny technical sound does not solve the issue. Nothing in our world can possibly replace the majestic sound of a pipe organ, unquote. And all God's people said? Number 3, the platform is renovated. Quote, the choir loft and other furniture, including a communion table, are all replaced with new items designed to modify worship activity, unquote. Number 4, and this is the order. I've got the email. I can show you. Number 4, the building is renovated. Basically, if it doesn't look like this person's idea of a traditional church that he likes, it must be headed toward apostasy. Number 5, music does a turnabout. Quote, there are many kinds of music, much of which can be used tactfully. This is not an easy area to discuss, but replacing beautiful harmony with discord, yelling, repetition, and songs written by low-talent writers is certainly not helpful, unquote. So 3 of the top 5 have to do with music, hymnals, organs, styles, and the other 2 are about buildings and platforms. These are the fundamental ways that you can know you're on the slippery slope. These are the fundamentals of the faith, right? Wrong. And the reality is that these kinds of things, equating preference with the Scriptures, are in direct disobedience with this text. The text says we are to come together, we are to strive together for something that's essential, not drive wedges using everything that isn't. So how can we expect heaven's blessings when we refuse to act like heaven's citizens? And what would happen if we all really humbled ourselves, put all of our preferences on the lower shelves, and put the truth and the gospel and the essentials on the top shelf? And like an entire nation when attacked, what if we could put away the petty differences and stand side by side as citizens of heaven under the banner of the gospel? Some years ago, I told a story here that happened and that I got to see and experience, and to me it was a powerful moment because I got to see some people humble themselves and come together, and I got to see the result of it. And so I'll share it here again, but I was serving as I was getting ready to graduate from college. I was working at a small church in South Georgia as a youth pastor, not too far from where you used to live, Thomaston to be specific. And, I came in as the assistant pastor, associate pastor, youth pastor, chief cook, bottle washer, and yard mower and janitor. So it was an exciting staff position. And we had interesting situations and some obstacles. One of the things I really wanted to do was to teach these folks, our young people especially, about how to just share their faith. And so we organized some things. We did some different approaches to sharing our faith. And And it was good to do that, but the truth is we weren't really seeing anything that looked like a great result. The church basically never saw people come to Christ. We never used the baptistry. I think we used the baptistry to store Christmas decorations in. And so and there wasn't a lot of expectation, and we were praying and hoping that God would move in hearts and that people would come to Christ and that the gospel would do its work. But frankly, not a lot was happening. I didn't really realize it, but there was a bit of a war going on in the church between two halves of a big extended family. And there were two men in the church that had had a huge fight years earlier. I didn't know this. I did notice that their two daughters, these cousins, didn't get along at all. And they both had a little clique in the church. And if you made this girl happy, then this group was going to hate you. And if you made that group happy, then this group was going to hate you. And so one of my goals was just try to deal with that and get these folks to get along, and it just wasn't happening. But again, I did not realize that years earlier that their two fathers had had a big falling out. They had had a huge fight. It had extended all through their families. And I also did not know that one of the men who was the chairman of the deacons, who always sat over here, and the other guy was just a leading man in the church, that they hadn't spoken to each other in years. In fact, looking back, I can kind of see it now. They would come in, this entire extended family would sit over here, and the other family would come in. I'm not sure why they kept going to the same church, but they kept going to the same church. They just wouldn't speak to each other at church, and they would sit in separate sections in church. And this had been going on for years. But then one Sunday morning, something very interesting happened. One of those two men stood up at the end of the service as we were getting ready to close in the final prayer. He just stood up and said, "Pastor, I have something I need to say." Now, my pastor was up at the pulpit, and he said, "Well, what do you need to say?" He said, "Well, I need to say it up there." And so he just starts walking toward the front. And I'm wondering what in the world is getting ready to happen. I am so glad I'm the assistant pastor. I just get to observe this. I'm glad I came to church today, for sure. And so he walks up to the front, gets in front of the pulpit, and he turns around, and he looks back at his brother, calls him by name, and says, "I have something to say to you." Now, you could hear a gasp going through the church because I think everybody besides me knew about the war that they had had. And I think everyone was expecting it to escalate, and it was going to be pretty interesting. He said, "Years ago, you and I had a huge falling out. We had a fight. We became extremely angry. We haven't spoken to each other in years. Our families got mad and picked up the fight. We don't ever speak to each other here at church. And over the last couple years, I've been thinking that I can no longer remember what the fight was about. But I am pretty clear about one thing. It was my fault. And I'd like to ask you to forgive me." His brother, who was sitting back near the back and over on the side, stood up, walked down the outside of Faith Baptist Church of Thomaston, Georgia, came across to the pulpit, face to face with his brother, and said words that shocked all of us in the church. He said, "You're wrong." I thought, I can't believe it. This man just apologized to you in front of God and everybody, and that's your response? You're wrong. You said you don't remember the details, and you can't remember what the fight was all about. I remember it vividly. And I can tell you for a fact, it wasn't you who was wrong. It was me. And you need to forgive me. Those two big old men hugged each other in the front of Faith Baptist Church of Thomaston, Georgia. Some family members got up and walked across and started talking to each other. Pastor said, "Does anybody else have anything to say?" And one of the two wives stood up and said, "I picked up that fight. I've been involved in it." Looked across to her counterpart on the other side and said, "I am so sorry. Can you forgive me?" "Well, yes, I can if you'll forgive me too." And then another family member, and then another family member, then another family member, then another family member. After the families had all said their things to each other, somebody else stood up and said, I'm not a part of that family. I wasn't a part of that fight. But I just feel like I have failed the Lord in some ways, and maybe this will just be a good day to just repent and make things right with my God. And then somebody else stood up, actually said something to somebody else. I offended you and I wronged you. And then it just started going around the church. I sit there thinking, I haven't been here very long, but Petitt, there is something you should apologize for, surely. My wife was sitting there thinking about 37 things I should apologize for. But, and I did. I stood up and I said, here's a couple things I know that I've been doing that I need not do anymore. We stayed there for hours. Nobody wanted to go. Finally, everybody who had something to say had said it. You could feel this love and this forgiveness. It was something you could almost see in that building. Those two families walked out arm in arm. Everybody in that church walked out united. We left. It was pretty late in the afternoon when we left. We had a 6 o'clock evening service. It was basically go home, turn around, come back. We were back in a couple hours. And that night, some stranger was there, and that stranger trusted Christ. As happened on the following Wednesday night and both services the following Sunday, and for several weeks, people came to Christ, people came to Christ, people came to Christ. I've never seen anything like it in my life. And it's all because one guy, one brother, decided he didn't have to keep the fight going. There was something more important than his pride. Most of you are too young to remember the details, but I remember feeling a little bit of what my dad must have felt huddled around that radio on September 11th, 2001. People my age remember vividly where they were. Some of you do maybe as well. But I was in Cleveland, Ohio. I was a staff member for Baptist Mid-Missions. I was following another staff member driving from Elyria to Cleveland, and he stopped at a stop sign and walked back to my car and said, you need to turn your radio to so-and-so station. I did. I'm listening. The first tower had just been hit. Smoke was billowing, but the people in that radio station were thinking it was probably an accident. Maybe a small plane had accidentally hit the World Trade Center. But as we drove a couple minutes later, the reporter who was broadcasting live from the scene watched the second plane hit. And I heard him yell out. I heard people around him yell out. And he said, the second tower's been hit. There's another huge fireball. He said, I think we're under attack. And to most of the country, it hit all of us. This is not a random accident. This is an attack against our country and against us. We got to the headquarters of the mission. I was living in Virginia, but I was just going up for a couple of days and did a couple of things, but nobody could think about the work, and all we could think about what was going on. So we went into the audio-visual room of Baptist Mid-Missions. I remember sitting there as the first tower came down, watching it live, watching the second tower come down. A day or two later, I was driving through rural Tennessee, actually on my way to speak at Tennessee Temple University. And I pulled over at some little exit somewhere out in the middle of the country to fill up with gas. And I was pumping my gas, and a little gas island was there. On the other side, another car pulled up, and a man got out. Sharp-looking African-American man about my age, and I spoke to him. And come to find out, he was from New York. He was from New York City, and 2 or 3 of his friends had died in the attack. In any other part of life, he'd have pumped his gas, and I'd have pumped my gas, and we'd have driven off. We might would have said hi. But we found ourselves talking like old friends, like brothers. The fact that he was from New York and I'm from the South, the fact we're from a different race, that we probably have different philosophies, all kinds of differences. It didn't matter. He was suddenly my brother. And in the end, we just hugged ourselves there each other there in that gas station. and encourage each other and win our way. I thought that was an amazing thing to see what happened in our country as the citizens came together because of this threat that had come. Well, God does not want the citizens of heaven to sit around and wait for a threat, wait for the next attack. He wants us to make up our minds that we are going to obey this one thing. We are going to conduct ourselves as citizens of heaven and all that means. And we're going to strive together for the faith of the gospel. So let's bow in prayer. And maybe you'd just like to stop and say, God, help me to be one who pulls together in the gospel, not drives apart. Deliver me from being the wedge driver. We all realize that God teaches that there are things that require separation, but not usually the petty things we fight over. God, deliver me. Give me a mind like Paul. Give me a heart for the gospel. Help me to care deeply and primarily about Jesus Christ, his life, his teachings, and especially his atonement, his death, his burial, his resurrection. Help me to live in his example. Help me to love like he loved. And help me to strive together with others, to partner together in getting the gospel to the ends of the earth for your glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. You're dismissed. No, you're not.